Jascha, welcome to Radio Wolf. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
You are a philosopher, an entrepreneur, a coach, keynote speaker, and you started as a process artist, if this is right.
Well, maybe I'm a trickster.
Maybe I'm a trickster.
It sums it all up.
And you just wrote a book in German about the great co-creation. And in fact, I think it's not too much to say that you kind of coined this term in the German language area. It is a term that did become popular recently, but it's kind of a new word. Let's just start. What was the motivation to invest your work into the vision of co-creation? Why is this something that you find is an important direction to think about?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, I think I believe in our power as human beings as to co-create, that is to design with other human beings and non-human beings the world we live in. I have a background in permaculture design, so that is a design-oriented methodology. I have spent many years of doing participatory design and democracy and citizen projects. And so I truly believe that part of the well-being of our societies and the global community on this planet is dependent on our ability to co-create and to bring forth the solutions we need to develop a good life on this planet as a global community.
It seems that using this term and focusing on term is also a particular emphasis on something that is particularly necessary in our times right now. I mean, you can say it's necessary always, but there's something, my guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we live in a time of exceeding fracturing of our social structure. And basically a time where it becomes more and more difficult to work together beyond certain bubbles of seeing the world, interpreting the world. And what you are focusing on is to counter this development and emphasize we need to do this together.
Yeah.
And how to do this together in spite of having huge differences maybe about everything.
Yeah. Well, I'm not so sure about if we've lost our capabilities of working together. Maybe it was even worth in former times working together. But still, I think the problems and the challenges we face as a global community are so huge, complex, and diverse that the need for coming together in completely new ways and working together in completely new ways is just so much more important than it ever was. We are not local communities with their local problems in their own cultural settings, but we are now a global community, a hugely diverse global community, and we face challenges on a planetary level. And we have to react fast. Example given in climate change, and we have to react in ways that have leverage. And I think that all calls for completely new ways of bringing the different perspectives, the different cultural backgrounds, the different political worldviews together in a productive way. And that is more necessary than ever, I believe. And of course, I mean, looking at how the world is developing in the last years with autocrats and populist movements taking hold of societies everywhere. I also agree with what you just said, that on the level of, for example, national societies, there's a lot of divergence and fracturing and also conflict, deep conflict, which needs to be healed in order to co-create, of course.
But you touched also something particular in what you just said that I think plays into the necessity of co-creation. Let's call it the exceeding over complexity of reality as we experience it in the global world. To say it simply, it's more and more impossible to oversee the reality that we are living in.
Yeah.
And to be able to work with the puzzle that reality is, we need each other even to see different parts of the puzzle and understand different parts of the puzzle. So there is something where we also have to let go of an individual kind of assessing reality and needing each other in a co-creative evaluation and assessing process where we only together hold the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something like that is an awakening process, or a process of awakening our collective consciousness as a planetary species. And my analysis comes from the whole discussion about the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is the idea that we as human beings are one of the strongest force to actually create the environments in which we live on this planet. But what is happening at the moment is it is a coincidence how we design the planet by way of living. And our way of living is capitalist societies, using resources of the earth and so forth. And in the end, by living this lifestyle, this capitalist lifestyle, we create an environment for the earth which will not sustain our life as a living community. And so if we take this idea of the Anthropocene for granted and for real, then we'll have to wake up collectively and face this challenge that we are already designing the planet with how we live and our attitudes and lifestyles. But if we want to survive, and if we want to the Earth ecosystems to survive, we have to do that much more consciously in a diverse design process, which is generative in an organic way, I would say. It has to be generative.
And you used twice now the word collective consciousness.
Yeah.
And that's maybe also something to kind of look into, because it is also in contrast to a very deep-rooted way of being, particularly in our Western European American culture, which is coming out of the 500 or 5,000 years, as you said, process of individuation and focusing on an individuality that I, in my autonomous way of perceiving reality, have to respond as an autonomous being, which the whole Enlightenment movement comes from. And there's something powerful and important about this. But it's maybe a one-sidedness of our perception of reality that everything comes to in a good sense. I don't mean in an egocentric sense, but in just I take responsibility as an individual in the way I see reality and how I respond as a citizen or as a governor of reality. It comes to me as an adult citizen. And that's, I think, an important part of what the democratic process is about.
Yeah,
But the collective consciousness seems to go in a different direction to bring into the picture, yes, that's maybe so, but we have to create something together, even together in consciousness.
Yeah.
Would you like to speak to that?
Absolutely. And I think it's both and. I think this adult citizen has a frame of reference, and that usually is a local community or nation state. And I think if we shift this to understanding that we're adult citizens of the earth, of the planet, that's a first step towards this kind of collective consciousness, I believe. And then there's the other dimension where obviously I would maybe even define it as an ecological collective consciousness, which is not just human, but human and non-human entities, understanding that we are part of this whole planetary organism, and that our actions will have effects on this organism and therefore on ourselves, our local communities, and our larger communities and ecological communities. And in our praxis in co-creation, it always means that we create a kind of field of resonance with what we actually want to work with, or for what challenges we have to design solutions. And we try to incorporate in this co-creation also the non-human entities. And through this methodology, we move forward to this collective consciousness of, yes, we are individuals, and that, in my understanding, what collective consciousness is very important, that we keep our sense of individuality, but also combine it with our sense of larger communities and being part of it, and having this, I call it transpersonal momentum of understanding that things I do, think, and act upon will also reflect in how the larger context is developing, if that makes sense.
No, very much so. I introduced you in the beginning of our conversation as a philosopher, but you wrote this book, but you're a theoretician of this work of co-creation, but you are very hands-on at the same time. And
Yeah.
you're working both with companies here in Germany and also in the political process.
Yeah.
So maybe it's helpful also from your experience hands-on, both with companies and in the political process, how can people envision the potential of this co-creative process?
That's always very, very difficult for me to explain, because the true answer, I believe, is you'll have to experience it. So you really have to become part of one of these processes. And whoever listens to this, I can only really invite everyone to look out for where are co-creative or participatory processes I can attend to, where there is a good forward-thinking facilitation and a good methodology behind it to experience that. And maybe many who listen to this podcast already have this experience, so I don't have to explain it. If I have to explain it, I can only do it by storytelling. So I can only try to bring in one of these processes. And just for those who listen to this podcast, so the processes we do are firstly design oriented, and that for me is a very important aspect of co-creation, because I feel people who use this word co-creation, it becomes a very flexible term these days, and it can mean more or less everything. Like, two people talking together is already meant to be a form of co-creation, and in a way that's right. Like, every interaction, we are co-creating something. but I mean it in a very specific way and in a design-oriented way. I mean it that people come together and as craftsmen, so to speak, design something, prepare something. They build models, they build prototypes, they write concepts, or they write new policies and laws for their constituents or whatever. So they actually create a tangible result and outcome, which is the result of this co-creation. So that is the first thing. And some of these processes I do is, for example, we do the National Citizens Assembly for the German Bundestag at the moment. And this is sort of on the brink between deliberative and co-creative methodology. Deliberation is people come together, citizens come together and discuss problems of their community, of their nation, and then make suggestions for politics. Like the next step in co-creation would be that those citizens would actually come together and write the laws themselves. They don't make just recommendations to politicians, but they actually become the sovereign who is not just ruled by someone who has the power to rule by delegation, but they take it back to themselves and write, for example, a policy in the process. Now, how does the co-creative process look like in reality? In reality, it is very hands-on and basic. People come together, and in the first step, to put it very simple, is they bring themselves towards each other and towards the subject they're working on in a deep state of resonance. So you can do that by all kinds of methodologies and formats to really try to create this dense field of, okay, there are different people with different standpoints and viewpoints, and there's also a subject, for example, food security. That was the subject of the last Citizens Assembly. And we now create a field where we try to make as many connections in as much depth as possible between all the participants, human participants of this process and the subject. Mm-hmm. That creates a sort of a density of understanding and embodied feeling in the group and with the subject that you then can start to innovate and co-create in terms of, now we understand where we want to go in future, what the vision is, and we can draw a path towards that vision from where we are now. And then you start creating, as a craftsman builds a table, for example, you can start building the necessary steps towards that future. And that is the co-creation. And what happens in between is that most of these groups undergo a kind of transformative phase, which is often experienced as a crisis. Mm-hmm. And in this crisis, the group experience despair, hopelessness. They don't see the solution. They don't see the future. They don't see the path by which they might go towards that future they want to go to. And that creates a crisis. And this crisis triggers deep responses towards collective trauma, towards just fragmentation, as you said, in this society. And then you have to work on that. So the fragmentation, you have to make a kind of healing process, a process where you really work with that trauma in society, in a community. Mm-hmm. And usually by doing that, you bring the group in the, I'm sorry, my computer does that by itself. I don't know how to switch it off. So by doing that, you create the opportunity for transformation, so that people really come to a point where they say, now we have the whole field, we are in resonance with each other, with the field, with the subject. We understand the deep pains and traumas of this field.
Mm-hmm.
And we will now work on healing those pain points, which will then enable us to create solutions for future we desire. And like in every step on that way, you'll have participatory co-creative methods to help facilitate the group walking along this way. And everyone who experienced kind of group processes knows, I think, what I'm talking about. The only difference with co-creation is that in the end, you return back to a very concrete and tangible result in the world we live in, like creating a space in a city, or designing a new mobility system for your town, or creating a new education system for a nation.
Before you gave this example, you made the point that you have to experience this. It's hard to describe it, and the best way to describe it is a story,
Yeah.
as you gave. And I think you're making this a deeper point that it seems to be on the surface level. Because
Okay.
of course, yeah, you have to participate, but the point, at least that I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the understanding of it, which is a certain particular intellectual cognitive process, doesn't meet it. It needs your participation with all your faculties of participation, emotional, spiritual, existential, that you cannot produce in a cognitive way. So that it needs different parts of our humanness in order to understand. And
Yeah.
and this is part of what this co-creation process, or maybe also if I may call it this way, the secret of this co-creative method is about.
Yeah. You're right. And most of us, I mean, I think there's nothing special or secret about co-creation processes, and most of us has experienced this kind of at least personal transformation and development. We all know that. We all had our epiphanies in life, or phases where we were in personal crisis and found a way out of it by shifting our perspective and opening new horizons in our own personal life. I think what we do not experience so much is doing that in a collective, in a group of people, and in connection with a very concrete result. We all have these frustrations with, for example, teamwork or politics as usual. And we're deeply frustrated by it because it seems that what we experience in our personal development processes, when we really feel alive, even though it hurts, this quality is not matched by what we experience in the political or collective world, like in our workplace, when we work in our teams, or when we go and watch a debate of the parliament or so. And we look at it, and maybe it's even the other way around if I think about it. We look at it and we think, this is not how life should be. This is not how a good process should look like. This is not, that doesn't feel alive. It doesn't feel powerful. It doesn't feel abundant. And we have this deep feeling of, it should be different. So what's the difference? Why doesn't it feel the same way as if I make a developmental move in my life? If I go through crisis and develop new possibilities for me personally, my life, why doesn't it feel it the same way if we look at politics, for example? and we have a deep longing for it. And I think maybe co-creation is just sort of reclaiming this aliveness in our collective processes.
Something that I again and again I'm fascinated by doing these interviews, particularly with people who are creating social innovation structures, let's call it.
Mm-hmm.
Like what I'm thinking about right now, Transition Town or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
How many of those people are deeply influenced by permaculture?
Yes, absolutely.
It's kind of all these people come from gardening.
Yeah.
I bring it as a joke, but I really mean it. And I think it says something, at least it speaks to me, that that there is also a deep
Permaculture and pattern language.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. And patterning and those two together. And
Mm-hmm.
but it's also you can look at it also in a way of looking into the gardening, and one kind of a cultural historical way of looking through the perspective of gardening to go from a French garden to an English garden to a permaculture garden, and see how our human understanding of gardening, or you can go back to the indigenous not gardening, but being basically in nature, and then seeing how on the heights of the European Enlightenment, we had this concept of a French gardening and this abstraction and all that. And, and all of a sudden, it becomes relevant how we see gardens.
Our gardens are a reflection of how we understand nature and life.
Yes.
And maybe we are now in a time where sort of our understanding is best reflected by permaculture gardens of life. Yeah.
That's where I wanted to go, and I really would like to get your reflection. Why is this so? And what does it teach us?
I think, well, from a point of view where permaculture was developed, it is a systemic worldview. Yeah. It is definitely an ecologically systemic worldview. And it even developed from there further, I would say, to a much more, to an understanding of how complex organic fields develop over time. And in the end, permaculture, if you study permaculture long enough, you get what I would say a procedural view of how development in the world works in complex systems, because that is what nature from a permaculture standpoint is. Like the organic development of nature, or even the evolution of nature, is the interaction of many elements in a complex developing field. Like there's no fixed stability, always moving and interacting. Mm-hmm. And by that you understand patterns of dynamics. And if you develop this view of patterns of dynamics, you can apply it to almost everything, and of course also to society. Mm-hmm. Not to say that society is like nature, which is, I believe, a sort of old notion or concept, but to say that we start looking at developmental patterns or procedural patterns in fluidity, complexity and fluidity, then this helps also to work in processes of co-creation, obviously.
I really like how you brought, for me surprisingly, permaculture together with pattern language right now, because they are also seemingly on the opposite side. There's kind of an opponent processing happening between both sides. of perceiving reality, and maybe that's part what's interesting, because the pattern recognition and then kind of finding patterns that work is something that really also needs just complex mental thinking, also, not only.
Absolutely.
But the other side, and I'm curious how you see that, is also a teaching in humility, because there's something in a simple garden, or in the permaculture perspective of a simple garden, that I'm not on top of. The complexity is just too much. I have to give up to kind of figure it out. I have to participate in the system or the organic reality that I'm perceiving. And it's kind of a humble participation process versus just figuring out process, which in itself changes me as a human being in relation to reality. And it's something where I have to grow in order to be a citizen who is able to participate in society.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there are two different notions of this, and one is very technical, and one is a very, whatever, maybe spiritual. I don't know, that's the right word. And if I'm talking about patterns, I'm talking about the notion and the theory of Christopher Alexander. And he was a mathematician, but he was also an eco-architect. And he was interested in the structure of nature and the order of nature, and the nature of order, actually. That's the title of his book. And his finding was that it is not the technical structures we think about. It is a much more fluid, dynamic order we are dealing with. And these patterns are patterns where we are already a part of the pattern as an observer to the pattern. And that brings us this, you called it the humbleness. If you start understanding that, because we are not the sort of godlike engineer who creates the system, which is out of us, which can also mean understanding patterns, but in a very technical and technical way. But this understanding of patterns, I mean, maybe the term generative, that's an interesting term, I think, at the moment, because we're also already starting to talk about generative artificial intelligence. And that is an algorithm-based generativity. I believe that the nature-based generativity Christopher Alexander is talking about, or permaculture is talking about, is different from that. But it's very hard to pinpoint where the difference is. Because you could argue that nature works like an algorithm, but that is definitely not meant by those who invented permaculture and pattern languages. It is more the understanding that generativity is a life force which drives complex development and transformation processes. And that it's the same term, but it can be totally different things. And I think we have to position ourselves in that respect.
Allow me to play with language a little bit. And interesting enough, it works better in English than in German. Because you're touching, at least in my perception, some spiritual or even religious territory in the grasp of reality. And when we use the term co-creation, in English, the word creation is also basically a Christian term for a reality. That, and to basically make a co-creation out of creation changes our perception of creation.
Absolutely.
Reality that I find significant. It's something, does something. When a letter's in, it changes something. There's again this humility factor or participation factor that comes in, that I find spiritual, you can just call it existentially significant.
It is, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, it is. And I would even say it always will be and always has been co-creation. But the notion of, yeah, there is a creator and there's a world outside the creator which is created, that is the paradigm I'm trying to shift with the term co-creation and the methodology I'm using as well. Mm-hmm. I'm very much based on the works of Donna Haraway, for example, and trying to find ways to overcome the duality between subjectivity and objectivity. And co-creation in the end is for me a way or a concept to get rid of those poles, basically, and find a standpoint where we understand that no, it's never the creator and the creation. It's always both and. It's a dynamic of that which creates and that which is created. It's both and at the same time, always.
Interesting that you went there, because that's kind of territory I just wanted to ask about, because I see the similarity between this co-creation concept that you wrote in this book and the idea of regenerative cultures. And it reminds me particular conversation I had on this radio with Daniel Christian Wahl. And one of his points of regenerative cultures is the transcendence of the subject-object divide, where we don't act in a region, we are an expression of a region in our human consciousness. Or to use your language, we co-create the region as being part of the region. In all that, now I'm really going philosophical.
As the region co-creates us, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a back and forth. It not even is a back and forth because there is no polarity.
Yeah.
If we go into that point, that's what I try to use this phrase, transpersonality with. That I mean, in that moment where we connect through resonance to a field, we are part of the field, and everything which happens to the field will happen to ourselves, while we are also, from the internal side, agents in the fields who shift the field. So, and it's really difficult to speak about it because our language itself is based on subjectivity and object, or subject and object divide. So we have to create these kind of metaphors. But that's how I feel it is. I always tell people who are my trainings, for example, co-creation trainings, that the first step is to think that the field or the subject chooses us as creators rather than we choose the subject. So if we are drawn into whatever we're working with and it feels like a valid and process which is alive, then we might also think of, not we choose this project, not we choose the subject, not we chose this process, but the process, the project, the subject chose us, because there are aspects in us which resonate with that process, project, or theme. And by this resonance of aspects which are in us and which are in the project, for example, we can co-create. They merge and they transform together. And I always say, if people ask me, oh, when do you know if a co-creation was a good co-creation, or if a process at all was a co-creative process? I'd say you know it by the pure fact if you yourself changed.
Mm.
Like if you have a sense of you've been designed, you've been created, newly created or recreated through that process,
Mm-hmm.
and also something else in the project has changed in the same way, that is sort of the check mark for, yeah, that's been a co-creation.
Mm. That gives me the courage to step into something that's maybe too much, but I would like to go there anyway, because somehow we're kind of in lofty territory right now.
Absolutely.
Uh, at, at the same time, um, what I find fascinating, that you're talking about very concrete projects in companies, in initiatives, in local and even national democratic processes.
Yeah.
To go hands-on in these processes in the way you're describing right now, and this is where it becomes tricky. Uh, uh, this co-creation process become for me something like a spiritual practice, a collective spiritual practice. Where,
Yeah, in a way, it's a kind of Taoism, because the
yes,
practice is like, you know, if you cook or walk through a city and it becomes your spiritual practice, I would absolutely agree. Doing these kind of projects, getting into the mud and dirt of political
mm,
exchange, and that is a spiritual practice in the end.
yeah, Taoism maybe the better word. It's not as loaded, uh, uh, but that's what I mean, and
Yeah.
that's also how I understand you. That you say that check mark is it changed me. Uh,
Yeah,
it's something I cannot objectify, not even in the other or in the process,
yeah,
but in my participation, something kind of uh, got liberated, or I can experience the Tao flowing. Let's put it that way. If we
mhm,
use the Tao language for that, but there are something very deep existential meet something very practical that really is about how to organize an organization or how to run a
yes,
political process
yeah,
uh, in a way that is, it couldn't be more practical.
yeah, absolutely. And I think co-creation is a means of completely ignoring this gap between there's some sort of inner spiritual development, and then there's outer political activism.
Yeah.
Uh, Even thinking in this divide is becomes absurd if you really get into co-creative practice, because you know that it's, again, it's a both and you can decide if you want to work more on sort of personal transformation or on political transformation. But in the end, this whole world is the playground in which we can develop spiritually. And it gives us the opportunity and the chances to develop spiritually by connecting with it and actually playing in it.
Mm.
You know, it's a playground, maybe even. And that's how I like to look at these projects. It's not like, oh my God, I have to find the solution for all the problems in the world. No, it is the whole development of this planet is evolution and is co-creation, and I can play with it. And in playing with it in a positive way, I get the chance to level up my game, so to speak.
Yes. A good part of our audience lives in Germany and also can read your book. The part of our audience who cannot, is there any part of your work accessible also in English language?
There are some interviews and YouTube videos in English available on my channel, and some text on Medium and so forth, but I'm working as fast as possible on an English translation of
Oh,
the,
okay.
yeah. So hopefully this year, latest in 1 year. That's the goal.
That's great to hear. Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thomas.